This was a project that should have been an absolute home run. It had everything: a genius director, a star who's on fire right now, a huge budget, and a promise to go back to the dark, gritty Stephen King source material. The 2025 remake of The Running Man was supposed to be the modern update to that campy, beloved 80s classic. But when the dust settled and the credits rolled, critics were all basically asking the same thing. How on earth did a movie with this much potential fail so spectacularly?
So, to really get to the bottom of this, we're going to walk through exactly what the critics said. First up, we'll look at why everyone thought this movie was a sure thing. Then, we'll dive into its tonal problems, its just confusing world, and its serious charisma problem before we get to the final and pretty brutal verdict.
I mean, seriously, on paper, this thing was a slam dunk. The hype was real, and you can totally see why. Let's just take a look at the ingredients that had everybody convinced this was going to be a massive hit.
Just look at this lineup. You've got Edgar Wright, a director who is a master of his craft. Then you have Glenn Powell, who is just an incredibly intense and captivating star. And maybe the biggest promise of all was finally doing justice to the original, much darker Stephen King novel, something the old Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, famously didn't do. Plus, with a budget of over $100 million, they definitely had the cash to make it happen.
So, yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? With a recipe that perfect, how did the final meal end up being so bland and unsatisfying? Well, it seems like the problem started with the movie not even knowing what it wanted to be. Okay, so the first huge red flag that critics all pointed to was this massive identity crisis. The movie just couldn't decide on a tone, and that indecision ended up poisoning, well, pretty much every other part of the story. The original '87 film, it knew exactly what it was. It was a fun, cheesy popcorn movie. It leaned into the silliness with Arnold's one-liners and that great over-the-top satire. This new one, though, critics said it was a total mess. It would jump from being this super serious, gritty melodrama about the hero's sick kid to these weird, quirky side characters and jokes that just fell completely flat. It was all over the place, never finding a consistent vibe. And that quote right there, it perfectly captures what happens when you have that kind of tonal whiplash. When you keep jerking the audience around, the rules of the world just start to feel blurry. Nothing feels grounded, and the whole experience was described as just sloppy and incoherent. And that sloppiness in tone led straight to an even bigger problem. The world building was a disaster. See, for a story like this to work, you have to buy into its logic, right? But according to the reviews, this movie's logic just completely crumbled as soon as you thought about it for more than a second. So, what was it specifically? What were the plot holes and just bizarre moments that completely took viewers out of the movie? Let's break down some of the biggest narrative failures. Man, where do we even begin? Critics said the plot was basically built on ridiculous coincidences. The hero doesn't win because he's smart or skilled. He wins because he just happens to bump into the exact right person he needs at the exact right time. Then there are key rules of the game, like having to film himself every 12 hours, that are just forgotten about halfway through the movie. And maybe the worst part? The entire public apparently goes from hating this guy to loving him for literally no reason, which completely kills the stakes. And look, this wasn't just a couple of minor nitpicks. Critics saw this as a complete, fundamental failure of storytelling. This lack of cause and effect, where things just happen, made it impossible to get invested in the world or to feel any real suspense. So you've got a world that makes no sense. And that leads us right into the next big issue. When the story is weak, you need amazing characters to carry the whole thing. And yeah, this is where the remake really fumbled the ball, especially compared to the original. Think about the original film. Half the fun was the villains, right? The gladiators. They had crazy names, cool gimmicks, big personalities, Fireball, Captain Freedom. They were awesome. The hunters in the new movie, on the other hand, were described as totally anonymous and boring. Critics literally called them generic assholes. No charisma, no style, nothing to make them memorable. They weren't characters, they were just moving targets. And that quote really says it all, doesn't it? The one element of the movie that should have been pure, spectacular fun, the hunters chasing our hero, was a total non-factor. There was apparently even a big villain reveal toward the end that had zero punch because the character was so underdeveloped. Now, to be fair, everyone was quick to say that Glenn Powell was great. They said he was intense, committed, and brought a real fury to the role.
But hey, one great performance can't save a script that's broken from the ground up. The film was reportedly full of other talented actors who were either completely wasted or showed up so late in the game that you just couldn't care about them.
All right, so when you add it all up, the messy tone, the nonsensical world, the forgettable characters, we get to the final judgment from critics. And let me tell you, it was not pretty.
The final consensus score landed at a very decisive 4 out of 10. And that's a score that screams this movie has major fundamental problems that just can't be ignored. So this score wasn't about just one thing being wrong. It was about everything being wrong. The tone was a mess, the world building made no sense, so there were no stakes, the boring characters took all the fun out of it, and to top it all off, critics said the pacing was just painfully slow, making the movie feel way longer than it was, all leading up to an ending that felt totally unearned.
So, what does a 4 out of 10 really mean? Well, it's pretty simple. It puts the film squarely in the below-average camp. The advice from critics was crystal clear. Save your money. Don't bother seeing this one in theaters, and maybe don't even bother when it eventually shows up on streaming. And this whole thing leaves us with a really interesting question to chew on. The filmmakers tried to do something new here, right? They went back to the book to create a more serious version, but in the process, they lost all the fun and charisma that made the original, which was a flawed movie, let's be honest, so memorable. It really makes you wonder, when a classic has that special, weird place in pop culture, is trying to remake it just a losing game from the very beginning? Something to think about.